Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We're going to talk about our new launch, our new Gold Open Access launch, Methods in Psychology. My name is Tanya Hassaune, and I'm the publisher working at Elsevier, responsible for this journal and for running it day to day. I'm here today with the editors-in-chief of the journal, and before I introduce them, I'd like to explain a little bit about how the webinar is going to go. We're going to speak for about 40 minutes. And we're going to allow questions to come in all throughout the webinar. Please feel free to chat in your questions, and we will be able to answer them after we're done with the discussion. After the discussion is over, we'll have Holmes and Elizabeth to answer your questions. For time difference reasons, Carrie is not able to join today. So let me just start with a little bit about the journal. The journal was launched last year, and it's a broad scope journal that it focuses on all aspects of psychology, all subfields of psychology, and publishes methodologies that are used in psychology and applicable in the field of psychology without having to specialize within a subject field and making an exception to others. Today with me to talk a little bit more about the journal, the three editors-in-chief. And we have Carrie Chamberlain, who is a professor of social and health psychology currently at Massey University in New Zealand, and he's heading the section of qualitative methods. We have Elizabeth Creamer, who is the professor emeritus of educational research and evaluation at Virginia Tech, and she's responsible for the section of mixed methods. And we have Holmes Finch, who is the George and Francis Ball Distinguished Professor of Education Psychology at Ball State University, and he is responsible for the section of quantitative methods. So I'm going to start off with a few questions, and I'm going to hand over to Carrie and everyone to discuss a little bit. So why, in your opinion, do we need this new journal in the field?
Yes, thanks, Tanya. When we started discussing this journal, the suggestion was that there was a niche for a journal like this in the field for psychology researchers. And looking around, we felt that that was quite the case, and that there was, while there's a number of journals that publish research related to methods and methodologies, there's none that look quite like the taking the focus and scope that we wanted for this journal. So when we thought about that, psychology, as we know, covers a very wide range of fields and domains. It's got a lot of interfaces with other disciplines. It's a very broad field, and it utilizes a very wide range of different methodologies and methods in doing its research. It's something of a leader in developing methodology in many ways, and other disciplines look to psychology for ideas about how to do research. But also psychology researchers look out to other disciplines for ideas of what they might do. So our concept for the journal is to publish important methodological articles focusing on methods and analysis and so on, that will seed ideas right across the fields and diverse fields of psychology, and hopefully grow and develop interest in methodology. And also it can take in ideas from other disciplines that are valuable for psychology to pick up and use. And psychology has been an innovator in some methods, but a very late starter in other methods. So we're hoping this journal will stimulate both directions of those developments.
Yeah, and I would just add, Carrie, thank you, that one of the things that I, as a quantitative researcher, am particularly faced with is sort of being siloed. So I have my journals, I read my area, and so I'm looking mostly at quantitative research, and it's actually difficult to find outlets where I'm exposed to other methods of research, so qualitative, mixed methods, and so on. And so I think one of the things that we're excited about with this journal is the chance to have all of the research methods together in one place. So I, as a quantitative researcher who might be interested in structural equation modeling, will look at the journal for an article on that and run across papers on innovative qualitative research methods or mixed methods. And that can spark both an interest in me as a researcher, but also give me insights into how I might work with researchers in those other fields. And I think that's something you just don't see in other journals in our field for the most part.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Creamer, and I was brought in to do the mixed methods piece. And what really persuaded me to join the journal, because my background is actually not in psychology, is the excitement and enthusiasm of perhaps expanding the uses of mixed methods within the community of people who are doing psychological research. And I think one of the things that's a little different, and we've all touched on this issue of disciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, but when you have a journal with a methods emphasis, you'll find that methodologists will read it who are from outside of the field of psychology, particularly in mixed methods, I know, and others have suggested this as well. People will reach for it because of the method, because it is mixed methods. Qualitative researchers might grab it because it's qualitative research, the same with the quantitative. So they read it because they're excited to see a different application of those methods. So it's a broad community within psychology, but also reaches outside. One of the probably little-known facts about mixed methods is they tend to be cited more than other types of articles, and that's partly because it reaches this broad audience of people who are really interested in the methodology. So I think we're ready, probably, Tanya, to move to the second question.
Sorry. You're the editors of the journal, and you get to look at all the articles that are coming in and obviously select the ones that get published. So what kind of articles exactly do you look for to be published in the journal?
Well, that's a great question, and that's obviously, I think, for a lot of prospective authors, that's the most important question as well. What is it that this journal is going to be publishing? What should I be, if I'm interested in the journal, what types of things should I be writing? And so I think we can sort of broadly break it down into three areas. Obviously, methodological is going to be the focus. So we can expand on that later, but just as a brief definition of that, we're looking at papers that sort of talk about how the research was done, what were the measures used, what was the method used, how was the data collected and analyzed, as opposed to the content area. Like I said, we can get into that more in a bit. Secondly, we want something that's innovative. So this needs to be highlighting new advances in whatever discipline, whatever area of research we're talking, and not simply displaying or demonstrating something that's been done a lot, which is, there's certainly a place for that. But our journal, we're looking for stuff that's innovative. And then thirdly, we want research that's rigorous. So we want methods that, or studies and papers that are they're well written, well designed, thought out, and I think any editor would tell you that. But I mean, given that our focus is on methods, we're really going to be paying close attention to the description of the method. Is it clear? Is it obvious what was done? And then how that was carried out. So were good research practices followed? Were good measures used? Were observations done in a very systematic and rigorous fashion? So I think that's kind of an overview of what we're looking for.
Yeah, I agree, Holmes, and I think we could expand on the notion. The journal's called Methods in Psychology, but our focus, as you said, is on the methodological issues in psychology, the way we do our business, the way we gather data, the way we make sense of data, and so on in psychology. And so we have a very ambitious aim. We want to become the leading journal that people turn to when they're interested in finding out about new methods and new methodologies to use in their research, and good ideas of how to do existing methodologies better, and so on. So we want to have a strong focus on methods and methodology, and that's just not how you do it, but also theoretical arguments about it, practical ways of doing research in new ways or innovative ways or clever ways that might make your data collection stronger, better, deeper, whatever you're looking for. But also for looking at the ways we do analysis of data, so all about gathering data, analyzing data, making sense of data, and so on. Anything methodological and method-oriented is of interest to us, particularly if it exposes new and relevant ways of researching ideas in psychology. So it can be about updating existing methods, it can be about adapting existing methods, it can be about stealing methodologies from other disciplines and showing how they could be used in psychology, or it could be taking an idea that's used in one area of psychology and promoting it for use in another area of psychology, like taking a research idea from cognitive psychology and showing how this might be used productively in a mixed methods research agenda. So broadly, methodological is our scope. Elizabeth, you might like to comment on what we mean by innovative.
Now, I think when people think about innovative, that's always a little bit of an obstacle, especially for early career researchers. They think innovative, you know, what does that mean? How can we be innovative? We've heard from both Carrie and Holmes about ways that you can make something, you can build an argument for the innovativeness of your work. Part of that challenge is to be explicit about what it is that is innovative, how you've adapted it to your particular domain, to your particular research circumstances, to your particular interests. Sometimes the modifications are not dramatic. Sometimes they are playing around with a visualization, creating an innovative way to display data, creating an innovative way to display the integration of different data sources. Another possibility, picking up on what Carrie's saying, is talk about applying from different domains, using theories that have been around for a long time that may not be very adaptable to other populations, to other settings, to more contemporary points of view, and in cross-cultural settings. Dissonant findings that that are empirically supported, analytically robust, but yet really add nuance to the theory or add depth or explanation to a theory can be really valuable as well. So again, it's part of the charge of the authors to not leave it to the reader to make a conclusion about what makes this innovative, but to be sort of upfront and explicit in saying, we adapted this methodology for the following reasons, or we use these two together in ways that others have not put them together. So it doesn't take paragraphs to build that kind of argument. You can build that argument with a few well-appointed sentences.
And I'd just kind of like to round out our discussion on this with we've talked about what we are interested in, what we do want to see. And I think it's important to let the prospective authors know what we're probably not as interested in our journal. And it's not to say that this type of research isn't worthwhile, but we're not interested in reports of the research studies themselves. So if I'm a clinical psychologist working on a study looking at methods for treating anxiety, and the focus of my paper is on methods for dealing with anxiety, and those are my outcomes. That's not the kind of paper we're going to be interested in, unless the focus of that paper is on methods for measuring anxiety or something like that. But the actual research itself would not be for our journal. There are definitely good journals out there for that. So we do want to emphasize that our interest is in methods, methodology, and how, as Elizabeth said, much better than I can, how is this innovative, and how have we put things together or used things in new and novel ways?
Yeah.
Thanks, Holmes. So an author is sitting, probably listening to this webinar, probably reading the journal website, and they're thinking to themselves, I have a really good paper for the journal and I'd like to submit it. What kind of advice or recommendations would you give them about the presentation of each article to be submitted to the journal? Elizabeth?
Yeah, let me say first that whenever you submit a manuscript, it is a place where there is an extreme attention to audience, a sensitivity to audience. So let's repeat sort of the idea that the audience we're talking about It could be in your content domain. It could be in another field of psychology, another area or specialty in psychology. It could be a methodologist from a field far afield from psychology. So one of the challenges is to recognize that broad interdisciplinary audience and to limit language, to simplify language, to limit the technical language that we've all sort of adopted and become accustomed to within our own area of expertise. It's almost like a second skin for us. We use that kind of language terminology. But the sensitivity to limit technology, technical language, jargon that is going to alienate the reader who is less interested in your domain knowledge, your content knowledge, than what you have to say about the methods.
Yeah, and I think as a quantitative researcher, Elizabeth, that's especially difficult for me and for people in my field, because we tend to, I mean, if you look at a quant psych journal, it's just overwhelmed with equations. And there's certainly, again, there's a place for that. But our journal is not that place. And so we would really encourage, we would encourage quantitative researchers to submit papers. But as Elizabeth said, they need to be very accessible for non-quantitative folks. So the way I would think of it is, write the paper in such a way that your colleague down the hall who teaches sports psychology or clinical psychology or school psychology could pick it up and read it and say, wow, that's a really interesting new statistical approach, and I get it. I understand what they're writing about, what she's trying to tell me, why she developed the method the way she did. And I'm really appreciative, me, the reader, that she didn't use 30 equations to describe that. I mean, you didn't need to. She didn't need to. So I think for those of us in the quant world, that's something we need to be especially attentive to.
I think the other direction we can take this in is to talk about the formatting and structure of articles and so on, and say that we're very open to receiving articles that can use innovative formats. We don't have a fixed idea of a format structure. There are guidelines on the website. You do need to provide an abstract and so on, although occasionally there might be a critical commentary paper that you want to write on the methodology or something that you feel, if it's an innovative way to take it, you might argue that it doesn't need an abstract. We're certainly receptive to a wide variety of formats and ideas and so on. Our basic core idea is to convey your message strongly to this broad general audience of psychology. So we're not bound by having structured abstracts and particular sequences of materials in the articles. The article should be structured to make your argument as clearly as possible to the audience that we're speaking to, the diversity of people across psychology, and hopefully interested people from outside the discipline who want to come and read what we're doing. So I think I hope that's a useful comment on that will encourage people to think more broadly and not feel that they're bound by the strictures of journal publication. The other thing I suppose we could comment on is the length of articles. We've got a notional length, a maximum of 9,000 words, which you can breach if you need to. We'll be looking hard at longer articles because we only have so much space in the journal, but we have a large sort of notional upper limit to allow for qualitative and mixed methods papers that usually take more space. But we're very happy to receive a 2,500 word paper that makes a very strong argument about a particular method or methodology. And we'd be pleased to see these as well. So no strict formats, no strong constraints on you as an author to produce a certain type of structured paper. I suppose the other thing, thinking about it, we should say, Tanya, is that we're also keen, if anybody out there has ideas for special issues that the journal should produce, we'd be extremely happy to receive those recommendations to come forward to us and consider them and work with authors to set up special issues on any of the fields of psychology or topics or issues that they think are important for the journal to pursue. So very happy to have your ideas on any of that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Mom. Thanks, Elizabeth. We're definitely, just to touch on the last point that Carrie mentioned about special issues, we will evaluate each proposal that comes in, and we're very keen on accepting any proposal to special issues that might focus on different aspects of methodologies in psychology. I just wanted to take a moment and thank all of our 3 editors for their immense effort on working on the journal. It's an absolute pleasure to work with them. And this will wrap up our portion of the discussion, and we'll move forward to the Q&A portion. And thank you. Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Holmes. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks, Tanya. Great working with you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you for your attention. I hope that was a useful session for you. We have now on the line, I'm Tanya Khassaoune, I'm the publisher, and we have on the line Elizabeth and Holmes, the editors-in-chief. As I mentioned, Carrie was unable to. Thank you for your attention. I hope that was a useful session for you. We have now on the line, I'm Tanya Khassaoune, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a feedback. I think the problem is sorted now. We have on the line Elizabeth and Holmes, and Carrie was unable to join due to the immense time difference. We have had some questions during the session that I'd like to go through. Please feel free to drop in your questions, and we'll answer them as the time permits. Obviously, we have about 35 minutes to answer questions, and we'll start going through them. So one question that was repeated was whether this webinar would be recorded. It will be recorded and available on the journal website. Please watch out that space for the webinar if you'd like to rewatch it again. So I'd like to start with the first question. We got a question for Holmes, actually. As an editor, what do you think about survey chunking, modularization? Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Are you more likely to desk reject an article that used this method?
No, that's a great question, and no, definitely not necessarily. I think what I would be looking for with that or any approach is how is what you're proposing or what you're doing unique. And is it something that's not really been, done before in other venues? And then also, I guess a secondary thing would be, or a secondary point would be for anything complex, at least complex for in my case, quantitative researchers, since that's my area. I would be looking for the writing to be clear and something that, as we said in the video, that a researcher who's not a quantitative methodologist but who wants to use these approaches would be comfortable with. But no, by itself, I would not desk reject that.
Thank you. Thanks, Holmes. We also got a question for Elizabeth. What do you recommend to young researchers to take care of while submitting a manuscript?
Repeat that, please. What am I what?
What do you recommend to young researchers to take care of while submitting a manuscript to the journal?
Oh, good question. For new researchers, what am I thinking about in terms of submitting a manuscript to the journal? Of course, step one, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of a clear title and abstract. That makes a huge difference to get past the editors, as well as to figure out who could be good reviewers for the article, as well as sort of an introduction for the editor to consider, is this something that fits within the purview of the journal? So I would start by the answer there, and I'm sure Holmes would add to that, by emphasizing the importance of that abstract as sort of like the front door into the article.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think, I don't really have, I think that's great, Elizabeth. I don't have anything to add either, other than, the abstract is the key, having a good title. I think those are Those are going to be the most important things initially, at least.
Thank you both. We've had an interesting question on review articles and whether there are any tips on, whether the journal accepts any review articles. Holmes, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, sure, I can start. And I know that that the three of us have had some lengthy discussions about that. And I think, Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, because it's entirely possible that I am. But I think we are definitely open to the idea of review articles. I think it would, particularly for a methods journal, those can be quite helpful if they, if they sort of cover an area in some depth and provide, again, novices or people new to the method with some deep background on the approach and also how it can be used. I think the one caveat I would have is that sometimes review articles can be, I guess, maybe too no, surface isn't quite the right word, but the idea being that they can be too shallow, I guess. And for a methods journal like this one, I think we're going to be interested in something that provides our readers with a great deal of depth so that they can take that information and go try it out themselves, go read more about it. So that would be my only caveat, is that a review paper be sufficiently in depth. But I don't know, Elizabeth, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. That's an exciting prospect, review papers. I mean, I can think of it multiple ways, but if I put my mixed methods hat on, for instance, if it's really focused, it would have to be focused. But for instance, the use of mixed methods in certain kinds of disciplines, as well as more focused articles on, say, for example, the use of visualizations, the way that theory has been used. It requires a depth of knowledge of methodological articles that not every author has. I know sometimes I've done them, and you think you've really covered the methodological literature, and the editors catch that you didn't, cite an article from 1979 that, say, talked about the difference between qualitative and quantitative approaches and qualitative and quantitative data. So I guess the only thing I really add here is to support the notion, those are very interesting. They require a good bit of knowledge about the method or the methodology.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We've had a few questions actually on specific topics that could be of interest to the journal. So one question is whether the journal is interested in cultural context, method adaptation to particular circumstances, perhaps, whether that could be something good to submit to the journal. Sorry.
If I could jump in with the
yes, please.
Yeah, if I could jump in with the mixed method side and say yes, very much so. I think a lot of a frequent use of mixed methods in certain fields in psychology is that exact topic, considering existing theories in cross-cultural contexts, challenging existing theories in terms of their timeliness or application to other populations. That is one of the uses that we really see in prevalent studies about how mixed methods have been used in psychological research.
Yeah, and I would just add that that's a growing area of interest and concern in quantitative research as well. Psychology has a very long, unfortunate history of ignoring underrepresented groups, or I would even go so far sometimes as to say that they make use of underrepresented groups without their input. And there's been a lot of discussion in the quantitative world in the last few years about the need to involve the folks that are we consider the subjects of the study in the study itself, and that's gone, I think, particularly in the medical field, but I think it's coming into psychology. The idea that folks who are involved in our studies, in many cases, have greater insights than we do, and because of this very cultural context issue. And so I think those kinds of studies would be really exciting, or those kinds of papers, rather, I'm sorry, would be really exciting for the quantitative side of the journal. Yeah.
Thank you both. We're getting quite a few questions, so that's really exciting to see. Thank you, everyone, for staying and interacting with this webinar. So moving to the next question, maybe Holmes can answer this. Are you interested in also including a section on the history of science or the philosophy of science, or epistemology section, whether that's something on the horizon or not?
Oh, that's a great question. So I have two thoughts. One is, I think having a special issue. So one of the things we might encourage that person to think about is proposing a special issue on the history of methods in psychology, and perhaps a particular area, qualitative approaches, mixed methods, or quantitative. I think that could be really interesting, and looking at having a variety of papers. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, this isn't something that Elizabeth or Carrie and I have discussed, so I don't want to speak out of turn. I think it would be cool, to be honest, to have, papers on the history of methods. I think the one thing, again, that I might mention is it would need to be focused perhaps on the method, as opposed to broader issues. And sometimes that's hard to untangle, but, so for example, studying, a paper on the history of intelligence testing, while very interesting, may not be the kind of thing we'd be after, but maybe history on, or a paper on the history of validation of scales and how, such as intelligence tests and things, how that's been done and how that's evolved over time. I could see that being really cool. But Elizabeth, you may have different thoughts. I don't know.
And this is really probably too idiosyncratic for anyone to pick up on, but I have been intrigued by the global differences in the application of methods, particularly qualitative and mixed methods, the trends. For instance, qualitative was really embraced supposedly much earlier in the Western world than it was in the U.S. and other parts of the world. So that's the broader context issue that Holmes is saying. It could be iffy, but the difference in the global application of methods interests me a good bit, and that partly comes from an awareness of the use of methods with indigenous populations, and how that has had a fairly profound effect on the methods themselves. So that's inherently interesting to me. It's inherently a methodological question. Those are sort of creative thoughts in answer to that.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks, Holmes. I'm going to move on to the next question. We're getting many of them, so we'll try to answer as many as possible. We got a question, and I'll say it verbatim. I would like to know if adaptation and validation of questionnaires could be published in the journal, even if the adaptation is for a small population, or if the methodology is strong and accurate.
Well, I can start.
Sorry.
I don't mind starting with that. So that's a good question, and so my initial reaction is it would have to be a particularly generalizable adaptation of a scale, I think. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is it would need to be something that a fairly broad group of readers would find interesting and useful. So, and that can be difficult because often adapting scales is done for a specific very specific subgroup or population, and it may not be generalizable. So I don't want to say no, it would never be of interest. I would say the author would need to provide some fairly strong evidence that this adaptation is something that would be used by a pretty broad scope of the readership.
I just add 2 points so we can get more questions. The author has to build a clear argument that the work is original, that it's an original adaptation of a method. And they have to be quite explicit in articulating that. And I think Holmes has touched on this issue of reaching a wider audience. Now, I think Carrie and maybe Holmes, I don't know about Holmes, but I know Carrie thinks of the audience as still primarily psychology, people who do psychological research. But I know in the mixed methods world, methodological articles cross disciplinary domains. So you might have someone outside of psychology interested in your methods, particularly if it's mixed methods. And so that's even more challenging in terms of an audience.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, I think I did receive quite a few questions, and I had a look at them, that ask about specific subject areas and how about educational psychology and how about this field of psychology. And I think the message needs to come across that this is a broad scope journal, that the methodology needs to be the start of the paper, and it needs to be applicable across fields and of interest to other fields. So I hope that answers the bulk of those type of questions. I have another question to Holmes. Does the journal care about sample size determination, and how does the journal handle research integrity issues? Maybe Holmes can take the first part and Liz can take the other part.
Sure. Yeah, well, that's a good question. And so because it's a methods journal, and I want to make sure I'm answering the question in the way that the writer intended, but so in a what I would call as a methodologist, what I would call a content journal. So the Journal of Educational Psychology or the Journal of School Psychology or something like that, the focus is on a conceptual issue. A sample is gathered specifically to answer a question about how an intervention, let's say, works in teaching children math. And in that case, sample size determination is key because you want to be able to explain why 200 subjects or whatever was sufficient. In a methods paper, or at least in my viewing of the quantitative part of this, the sample size issue is not necessarily the same because we're really focused on a particular method. So what I would say is, if you're demonstrating a new method for conducting regression, or just demonstrating a new way to estimate reliability, then the sample size needs to be sufficient to get good estimates of your parameters. But I would not view it in the same way I would for a conceptual journal or a journal focused on the content. So I guess, in other words, yeah, you need to have a reasonable sample size, but that's not going to be a big an issue, maybe.
And how about research integrity? Yeah, Liz.
Let me jump in on that one. On the research agenda integrity, though, the sample size, I'll make a comment as well. The research integrity issue is a really big deal in mixed methods because it's expected that it's like multi-methods. It's expected that you're using different research approaches and that one of them is qualitative and at least one of them is quantitative. And that those methods, that those data are analyzed using appropriate methods. So one of the big issues in mixed methods is the tendency to want to take qualitative data and turn it into quantitative data, which can be all right in the end, but if the only analysis of qualitative data is counting how many people said this or how many people used certain words, simply quantifying qualitative data is not respecting the integrity of qualitative approaches. Usually it's the qualitative piece that's the weakest, and one way a qualitative piece can be really weak is when using most methods, although there are exceptions, when the sample size are ridiculously small, if I could be blunt. Occasionally 6 people or 4 people might be adequate in biographical research, for example, but that's not a genuine qualitative contribution to mixed methods. And mixed methods really is looking for the integration of different methodological approaches.
Thank you, Liz. I'd like to take on the next question. There's been quite a few questions about open access and what type of fee does the journal have. As mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is a gold open access fee, and there is an article processing charge. And all the information related to that can be found on the journal homepage. And I understand, as I saw through a few questions that came in, that authors from different countries have different abilities and different funding agencies behind them, and I understand that. And Elsevier has partnered with a program called Research for Life, and it offers discounts based on where the author is located. Please have a look at that. All those resources are on the journal homepage. You can find them if you go to elsevier.com, you go to the journal homepage, there's a button called Open Access. You can find all the information about the licenses and the open access fee, what type of discount we currently have, because we have a general discount at the moment. And then there's a link for Research for Life to know your eligibility. We also have funding body agreements and agreements with some universities or countries even, that authors from those countries or from those universities are able to publish open access without having to pay the charge themselves. All of this information is on the journal homepage. I highly encourage everyone to go and review this information when submitting to the journal. Okay, so the next question is actually really interesting. I'm going to ask it to both Liz and Holmes, and please, you can answer each based on what are you handling at the moment. So can you give an example of a good paper you received lately? So Liz.
There's quite a bit of use of mixed methods in math education, and math educators tend to use a lot of video recordings of students as they try to cognitively process new concepts. So one of the papers that has already been out, this mixed methods, really plays around with the idea of what do you do with video data. You can count again the occurrences and the number of occurrences, but they can be used more creatively than that. So creatively using video data or visual data is one of the articles that I was really pleased to receive.
Yeah, on the quantitative side, we've gotten several pretty good ones, and one that I thought was really interesting was, and this actually gets back to the cultural context question we had earlier, and that was some folks are trying to use emojis as a way to, I guess, better communicate and receive responses from people in a wide variety of contexts. So rather than, I mean, you know, if you're familiar with measurement with small children, you know that one of the tricks some people use is like a smiley face, a frowny face, kind of a neutral face as a way of getting responses. But that's fairly limited, kind of positive, negative, or neutral. And so this was an attempt to basically define emojis in a certain way, you know, give people a dictionary of emojis, pretty small dictionary, and then ask questions and get responses back from with the emojis. And so that's been kind of cool. The other one I would say that has been of some interest is some folks looking at issues around Mechanical Turk as a way of collecting data, and we've gotten a couple of papers in there. And so, you know, again, those are both papers, what I liked about them is they're very much applied. They're something that a reader can take and run with, and they're well written.
Thanks, Holmes. The next question is more of a philosophical question, and I actually really like it because I like questions that promote people to think critically of how research is conducted. The question goes as, what is the meaning of novelty? How do you define novelty, and how it's different from research gap? Can people do research on the same topic of the same area and then have two ways to construct the study or construct the point of view? Holmes, would you like to have a go at this question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if I have a great answer, but I'll try, because it is an important question. And so, I mean, obviously, we all strive when we do research to do something new, to do something unique, and so I don't know that that's. I don't know that I would always say that equates to novel, even if it's new. In my opinion, I should say I'm very open to being swayed. So, the authors sending things in can make a case for why what they're doing is unique. But in general, I guess when I think of novel, what I'm thinking about is a paper that addresses a problem. It could be an existing problem, like the author or like the writer of the question said, but a method that addresses a problem in a way that it hasn't been addressed at all before. Or so the emoji example is one where people are taking a very common cultural artifact and employing it in a fairly unique way. As opposed to a lot of the papers that I myself might write, which would be tweaking a particular statistical method for a very specific kind of a problem. I wouldn't see that as maybe as good a fit for this journal as someone saying, hey, this is a very different way to measure people's opinions or feelings about a topic. That's a terrible, I realize that's just a very vague answer. So I guess I would just close by saying that novel in my mind, or what would be good for this journal, is something that either introduces a very new approach, something that hasn't been done before, or takes an approach from another area of quantitative methods and applies it to something it hasn't been applied to before. And Elizabeth alluded to this earlier, and I would agree with her that I like the idea of our authors and our readership being from a wide array of disciplines, partly because you can do that. You can take ideas from sociology, econometrics, and so on, and apply them to psychology. So that would be my kind of lame response.
Thank you, Holmes.
Yeah, let me jump in with the...
Yeah. Please go ahead. I wanted to ask if you have anything to add. Yes.
Well, I know the idea of novelty is particularly intimidating to new researchers. And sometimes when I talk about this in workshops, people say, well, really, I'm not in a position to be original. Maybe I don't know enough. Holmes kind of focused on the issue of novelty of topic. I would focus on novelty in the way, sometimes it can be novelty in the way the data are presented in a publication. It could be novelty in the use of a visualization. It could be novelty in the use of a graphic. It could be novelty, again, in reporting. So the novelty could occur at the reporting end, and I think of it not as necessarily changing the face of knowledge or the face of understanding of knowledge, but of it as something that grabs the reader's attention. You remember the article because, oh yeah, they're the one that had that really incredible visualization that sort of captured the whole article. So I would suggest it's not only in topic, but it's in the way you present your data.
Yeah, I would totally agree, Elizabeth. I think you said it much better than I did. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Your boss.
No.
This is a really good question coming in. Do you find methods dependent from standpoint of the subject, and does involving subjectivity in research matters in production of knowledge? Sorry, I might have not read it correctly. Let me read it again. Do you find methods dependent from the standpoint of the subject? Does involving subjectivity in research matter in the production of knowledge? Liz?
Yes, I think if Kerry Chamberlain was here, he's our qualitative. He's the one who wears mostly the qualitative hat. He would definitely, if you just change the word subjective to interpretive, and a validly interpretive component, but I think you're talking about the perspective of the participant, that certainly you're seeing in intervention research in the medical world, for instance, in drug trials and all kinds of interventions, the growing recognition of the importance of bringing in participants. We call them in qualitative world participants, not subjects. Subjects is good too. Bringing in stakeholders, like for instance, if you were working with teachers and doing research involving teachers, bringing in their perspective. So yes, I think it's very important to develop a multidimensional perspective. I lost you.
That's great, thank you. Holmes, from your point of view, would the emphasis be it's going to lean more towards well-crafted design, or would it be more on cutting-edge statistics? What would be your viewpoint on that?
I think the design, I mean, I don't mean to minimize the cutting edge statistics, and so I want to emphasize or hasten to add that I think
we would all like to have cutting edge statistics, right?
So what I would say, and this is but the reason I mention the design first is because oftentimes when we write papers on cutting edge statistical methods, they tend to be very technical papers and highly full of equations and that sort of thing. And those are great. I mean, I read those kind of papers. I've written them myself, but those are for a more statistically focused journal. So if you were going to write a paper on a cutting edge statistical method, I think that would be great, but be sure that the focus is on what the method does, how it can be used, provide a great example of using it and interpreting the results from it. The design, the reason I said design first is because that is very generalizable to a wide audience. And when I say design, I don't mean just how'd you get your sample and that kind of stuff, but more broadly, what are the various approaches you use to address your research questions? And I think that involves the sampling, but it also involves your measurement, the statistical methods you used, and putting that all together in a package. So whichever route you go, hopefully both, the focus again will be, and I know I've said this several times, but I think it certainly bears repeating, the focus will be on something that a broad array of readers can take and use in their own work.
Thank you, Holmes. I think we got the signal that we have one more question to go. I'll ask you both this question very briefly so we can wrap up the session. So, Elizabeth, why don't you start with how can you comment on the recent trends in dynamic methodology used in psychology?
Can I comment on the what? Sorry, I didn't hear all the words.
It's okay. I'm sorry. The recent trends of dynamic methodology used in psychology.
I bet I'm going to answer this in a way that isn't the same use of the word dynamic that the questioner is thinking, but it happens to coincide what I was thinking of in the design question. I think that some of the originality and novelty in I can't speak very well to the quantitative domain, but to the qualitative and mixed method domain comes from adaptations that are made as unexpected things occur during the research process. So I think of dynamic as adaptable, that we ended up having to add a phase because the data were contradictory, or we ended up not getting the results we were hoping for, so we ended up doing something different than we'd planned. We adapted our design. I think of that as a dynamic. Obviously a well-planned design is very important, but the rigid sort of protocols that you see with some methods doesn't apply as much to the domains that I deal with.
Oh, thank you. And Holmes, do you have a quick note on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that the idea of adaptability, and there's a whole area of statistics and research design looking at essentially adaptive randomized controlled trials, and that's not the only kind of dynamic or adaptive approach, but certainly one that that a lot of us would be familiar with. But yeah, and I mean, think about how the coronavirus pandemic has changed very abruptly how people are doing research. And so I would echo Elizabeth that I think emphasizing ways to make your research dynamic or to make it flexible as we move forward would be very, very welcome in the journal for sure.
Great. Thank you so much.
Well said.
This wraps up the questions that we're able to answer at the moment. Just to reiterate, this is a recorded session and it will be posted on the journal website, so please keep an eye on that space. I would like to thank our speakers today, Elizabeth Kramer and Holmes Finch, the editors-in-chief of the journal, and obviously Kerry Chamberlain was not able to join, but I'd like to thank him for his time to have the first part of the session, and obviously he's in our thoughts at the moment. And yes, if you have any questions, please do go to the journal homepage on elsevier.com, Methods in Psychology. All the information on open access are available. There's also a way to reach out to the journal through the journal website if you have any questions. Thank you so much for your time today.
Hello, everyone.